Have you ever imagined a moment so shocking, so unbelievable, that it forces the world to question everything it thought it knew about wealth, power, and respect? Picture this: a man worth billions, a man who could command entire boardrooms with a single glance, a man who lived in a mansion so vast that most people would never step inside its gates. Now imagine that very man on his knees, his voice shaking, begging for forgiveness. Not from a rival executive, not from a political leader, not even from his own family. No, he was begging forgiveness from the one person he had spent years ignoring, humiliating, and treating as less than human: the maid who scrubbed his floors. Sounds like something out of a movie, doesn't it? But this story isn't fiction. This is real. And the deeper you go, the more it challenges the way we think about class, race, and dignity. Because at the heart of it is a woman who was invisible to everyone but herself. A woman who had spent her life working in the shadows, carrying burdens no one noticed, her name never mentioned, her face forgotten the moment she left a room. Yet one day, through a twist of fate and the unshakable strength of her own spirit, she became the person who brought the richest man in the city to his breaking point. Now, before we dive deeper, let me ask you this. If someone had spent years humiliating you, stepping on your dignity, making you feel small, and one day the power shifted, would you forgive them? Or would you finally make them feel every ounce of the pain they once caused you? Think about that, because by the time you hear the whole story, you'll be forced to decide where you stand. The Maid story begins in the grand mansion of one of the city's wealthiest families. Marble floors polished, so clean they reflected the chandeliers above. Gold-trimmed staircases that seemed to spiral into infinity. Dining tables longer than some people's entire living rooms. To guests, this house was the definition of elegance. But for her, it was a battlefield. Every corner of that mansion carried reminders of where she stood in the hierarchy. She wasn't family. She wasn't even staffed with titles like assistant or manager. She was the maid, the one who slipped in silently before dawn, cleaned up the messes no one acknowledged, and left long after the last guest had gone home. And in a place where appearances meant everything, she was the one who was never meant to be seen. Her dark skin, her simple uniform, her tired eyes, they all made her invisible in a world that valued designer dresses, diamond jewelry, and powerful last names. Guests often spoke in front of her as if she wasn't even there, whispering secrets they thought she was too unimportant to notice. The billionaire himself rarely addressed her directly. When he did, it was short, dismissive, sometimes cutting. To him, she was a piece of the house, like a chair or a curtain, useful but unworthy of respect. But here's the thing people forget. When you treat someone as invisible, you forget they can see everything. She noticed, she heard, she remembered, and little by little, piece by piece, she began to uncover a truth that could shake the very foundation of the billionaire's empire. You see, wealth can hide many sins. It can bury scandals beneath charity galas. It can silence critics with expensive lawyers. It can rewrite history in glossy magazines. But no amount of wealth could erase what she knew. No amount of money could undo the moments she had witnessed. And though she carried those truths quietly for years, fate has a way of forcing the unseen into the spotlight. So, how does a billionaire end up begging forgiveness from his maid? How does a man who owns half the city suddenly crumble before a woman the world refused to acknowledge? That's the story we're about to unravel. And as you listen, I want you to keep asking yourself, if you were her, what would you have done? Would you show mercy or would you demand justice? Stay with me, because the moment you hear how it all unfolded inside those mansion walls, you'll understand why this story is spread across the world, leaving everyone who hears it stunned and questioning what it really means to respect another human being. The maid's life inside the mansion was a study in contrasts. To outsiders, it seemed glamorous. Working in the most beautiful house in the city, surrounded by luxury most people could only dream of. But to her, every step across the marble floor was a reminder that she did not belong. The chandeliers sparkled for the guests, not for her. The silk curtains, the imported wines, the laughter of people who had never worried about their next meal. These were not her world. She was there to clean up the crumbs, to polish the glass after the laughter had faded, to sweep away the evidence of lives lived in excess. But sometimes, the line between her invisibility and her humiliation was deliberately crossed. It wasn't enough for some to ignore her. They wanted to make sure she knew her place. One night, at a gala thrown by the billionaire himself, the cruelty reached its peak. The mansion was filled with powerful men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. Cameras flashed as luxury cars pulled into the driveway. Champagne glasses clinked. Violins played softly in the background, and every corner of the house was bursting with laughter and conversation. For the guests, it was a night of indulgence. For her, it was another battlefield. She moved silently among them, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres, collecting empty glasses. Her uniform pressed but plain. She had been trained not to look guests in the eye, not to linger, not to exist beyond her function. But that night, as she passed a group of wealthy young guests, laughter erupted. Not at a joke told among themselves, but at her expense. "Look at her shoes," one woman whispered loudly, tilting her champagne flute toward the maid. "Those don't even shine. Can you imagine wearing those rags every day?" Another guest, emboldened by alcohol and arrogance, smirked. "She probably thinks working here makes her part of the family. Sweetheart, you're just here to clean up after us." The group roared with laughter, and though her face remained calm, her chest burned with humiliation. She lowered her eyes, willing herself to keep moving. But the moment was far from over. That was when the billionaire himself walked by. He caught sight of her, tray balanced carefully in her hands, and instead of defending her, instead of shutting down the cruelty, he joined in. "Don't stand there looking lost," he barked, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You're not here to watch the party. You're here to make sure no one notices a mess. If you can't even do that, maybe you don't belong here at all." The words sliced through her like glass. Guests turned their heads. Some gasped, others laughed nervously. In that moment, the maid wasn't just invisible anymore. She was spectacle, reduced to shame in front of hundreds of eyes. And she couldn't answer. Not because she didn't have words. Oh, she had plenty. But because speaking up meant risking her job, the paycheck she depended on, the fragile livelihood she had pieced together. Silence became her shield, though it cut deeper than any insult. That night, as she cleared half-empty plates littered with food wasted by those who never thought twice about hunger, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The laughter, the sneers, the billionaire's voice echoing in her mind. She had scrubbed floors until her hands cracked, worked hours that left her too exhausted to dream, endured silence and invisibility. But public humiliation was something else. It wasn't just about her. It was about every maid, every janitor, every unseen worker who had ever been treated as less than human. And here's the thing about humiliation. It doesn't just hurt. It lingers. It burns into memory. It turns into fuel. Because in that room filled with wealth and power, none of them realized that she carried more than a tray of glasses. She carried knowledge. She carried secrets. She had seen the billionaire in moments he thought no one was watching. She had heard conversations meant to stay behind closed doors. She had pieced together truths that could unravel everything. That night, when she finally left the mansion long after the guests had gone, she walked out with her head bowed low. But inside, something had shifted. Humiliation had lit a fire, and though it flickered quietly at first, it was a flame that would not go out. So when you think of that gala, picture it not through the lenses of the photographers capturing glitter and glamour, but through her eyes, the eyes of the maid carrying the weight of the world's cruelty and the power of a truth no one expected her to wield. And remember this, the higher people place themselves above others, the harder they fall when the balance shifts. And for this billionaire, the fall was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. The next morning arrived with the usual rhythm of the household. The billionaire's family had a strict routine. Breakfast precisely at 7:30, a table set with silver cutlery, polished crystal, and spread worthy of royalty. Marie, like clockwork, was the one who had arranged everything before the family descended from their rooms. To an outsider, it may have looked like wealth had created an image of perfection, but beneath that polished surface lay cracks so deep that only those who were closest to the family could see them. On this morning, though, the atmosphere was different. There was tension, a sharp edge in the air, The patriarch, Charles, had been restless through the night. His wife, Evelyn, a woman whose elegance had always been matched by her icy demeanor, noticed that her husband hadn't spoken a word at dinner the night before. His usual arrogance, the way he dismissed the staff, the way he scrolled through his phone as if the world revolved around him, was muted. Instead, he looked haunted, almost distracted, as though a ghost had sat down beside him at the table. Marie carried the coffee pot, her steps quiet, her eyes cast down as always. She had perfected the art of invisibility, walking through rooms without being noticed, speaking only when spoken to, folding herself so small that she was almost like the wallpaper. But this morning, Charles's eyes followed her as though she carried an answer to a question he couldn't yet form. "Marie," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence like glass. The room stilled. Evelyn paused with her teacup halfway to her lips. Their son, Jonathan, raised an eyebrow, confused by the unusual attention. Never, in all the years of Marie's employment, had Charles addressed her in front of his family. "Yes, sir," Marie replied softly, her accent betraying her origins. Humble roots, a small town far removed from skyscrapers and private jets. Charles cleared his throat. Have you worked here long?" The question was so odd, so unnecessary, that Evelyn let out a small laugh. "Charles, really? She's been here for nearly 10 years. Surely you know that." But Charles wasn't laughing. His eyes were locked on Marie, and for the first time there was no arrogance, no disdain, only something unsettled, something fragile. Marie hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Almost 10 years." 10 years. Charles repeated quietly, as if tasting the number on his tongue, as though it carried more weight than anyone else could hear. The silence that followed was heavy. Jonathan smirked, rolling his eyes. To him, Marie was just a maid, an old presence in the house, someone so ordinary she was practically furniture. "Dad, are you seriously having a heart-to-heart with the help?" he said with chuckle, his tone dripping with the same privilege his father had once worn like armor. But Charles didn't answer his son. His eyes lingered on Marie as though he saw, for the first time, not a maid but a living person. A person with secrets, with pain, perhaps even with answers to the gnawing guilt that had kept him awake. Evelyn snapped her fingers sharply. "Marie, that will be all." Marie nodded and slipped quietly out of the room. But as she left, she could feel Charles's gaze following her. It unsettled her. For years, she had perfected the art of not being seen. Why was he looking at her now? Later that day, Charles retreated to his study, a cavernous room lined with shelves of unread books. He poured himself a drink, though it was still morning, and sat down heavily in the leather chair that had always made him feel powerful. But today, the weight of the chair felt more like a throne of judgment. He couldn't shake it. The way Marie had looked at him when she answered. Her eyes, they weren't just the eyes of a servant. They held something deeper, something that cut through him. He leaned forward, his drink untouched, and whispered to himself, "Why does she look at me like that?" That evening, the storm finally broke. Charles had been pacing the hallways, his mind restless, when he overheard a hushed conversation between Marie and another housemaid. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the words froze him where he stood. "He doesn't even remember, does he?" Marie whispered, her voice trembling. "All these years, and he doesn't even know who I am." Charles's blood ran cold. The other maid muttered something comforting, but Charles heard nothing else. His ears rang with those words, pounding in his skull. "He doesn't even know who I am." That night, Charles barely slept. Memories from decades past began to resurface. Fragments of a life he had buried beneath layers of money, women, and arrogance. He remembered a girl, not much older than Marie was now, standing in the rain outside a cramped apartment building. He remembered promises he had made, promises he had broken, and worst of all, he remembered walking away when she needed him most. The realization hit him like a freight train. Marie wasn't just a maid. She was a ghost of his past, standing quietly in his home, serving his meals, cleaning his floors, carrying the weight of secrets he had pretended never existed. The next morning, the mask finally cracked. Charles walked into the grand hall where Marie was dusting the frames, her hands steady, her expression calm. He stopped in front of her, his throat dry, his chest heavy. "Marie," he said, his voice low, breaking. She turned to face him, polite as always. "Yes, sir." But this time he didn't see a maid. He saw the daughter he had abandoned. And in that moment, Charles, a man who had commanded boardrooms, bullied competitors, and bought politicians, felt his knees buckle. He sank down before her, the marble floor cold against his knees, his pride shattering into pieces too small to ever gather again. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "God forgive me, I'm sorry." Marie froze, the feather duster slipping from her hands, landing silently on the polished floor. For the first time in her life, the powerful billionaire who had never bowed to anyone knelt before the maid he had once left behind. And the entire household, watching from the shadows, knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. The collapse of a man's pride and the birth of a reckoning decades overdue. The room was so silent, one could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Charles knelt there on the polished marble, his expensive suit creased, his once impeccable composure shattered. A billionaire on his knees, before a maid. It was a sight so unthinkable that the staff, who had witnessed countless scandals behind closed doors, could hardly believe their eyes. Marie stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest. For years she had swallowed her pain, her truth, her story. She had become a shadow in this house, a quiet observer of wealth and privilege, carefully erasing her own history, so she could survive each day in silence. And now, here was the man who had caused that silence, kneeling before her as though the weight of his sins had finally crushed him. "Sir, please get up," Marie whispered, her voice trembling. But Charles shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I can't stand, not until you hear me, not until you know that I regret everything, every choice, every cowardly step I took away from you. Those words, away from you, were like a spark hitting dry wood. Marie's lips parted, but no sound came. She glanced around, suddenly aware of eyes watching from the shadows. Evelyn stood near the doorway, her hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles were white. Jonathan lingered just behind her, his jaw slack, his arrogant smirk wiped clean from his face. The staff, drawn like moss to flame, stood at a respectful distance, their expressions torn between confusion and awe. Evelyn was the first to break the silence. Her voice was sharp, slicing through the tension. "Charles, what nonsense is this? Get up. You are humiliating yourself and this family." But Charles didn't move. His eyes never left Marie's. "It's not nonsense. It's the truth. I can't hide it anymore." He turned, his voice rising with desperation. "For years I buried it. I pretended it didn't happen. But here she is, in front of me every single day, carrying the weight of my betrayal. Do you know who she is, Evelyn? Do you?" Evelyn's face twisted, half in shock, half in fury. "She's a maid, Charles. Nothing more. Don't you dare degrade us by entertaining such ridiculous. She's my daughter." The words thundered through the hall, echoing off the walls like a judgment passed. Gasps erupted from the staff. Jonathan took a step back, his eyes wide, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. Evelyn staggered, her composure crumbling for the first time in years. Marie's legs weakened, her hand reaching out to steady herself on the nearest table. Her secret, the one she had carried in silence, was no longer her own. It had been thrust into the open, raw and undeniable. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Evelyn's voice cut through, cold and venomous. You expect me to believe this? That this woman, this servant, is yours? Do you know what you're saying, Charles? Do you realize what this will do to us? To Jonathan? To everything we built?" Charles turned toward her, his face pale but resolute. "Everything we built? Evelyn, all this wealth, all this power, it's built on lies. On me running from responsibility. On me abandoning my own blood. What kind of foundation is that? A house of glass, waiting to shatter." Jonathan's voice cracked with disbelief. "Dad, what are you talking about? She's been in this house for years. She's cleaned my room, for God's sake. How could she be my sister?" Charles lowered his head, his voice breaking. Because long before I built this empire, before I married your mother, I made mistakes. I made promises I didn't keep. I left behind a woman who loved me and a child I should have protected. When I found out later, I was too much of a coward to face it. And now, for a decade, she's been here, unseen, serving us, while I pretended she was no one. But she is someone. She's my daughter. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Marie's chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to demand why it said nothing all these years, why it let her live in silence and invisibility. But the words caught in her throat. Evelyn's fury was volcanic now. She stormed forward, her heels clicking against the marble, her voice venomous. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed us, Charles. You've ruined this family's name, our legacy, everything we've worked for. And for what? For Maid. At that, something inside Marie snapped. Her voice, soft for so long, rose with a strength that shocked even her. I am not just a maid. The room went still. She stepped forward, her hands trembling but her chin raised high. For years, I've lived in this house, cleaning your messes, staying silent while you treated me like I was invisible. But I have a name. I have a history. And whether you like it or not, I have blood that ties me to this man. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. But don't you dare stand there and reduce me to nothing. Her voice cracked, but the fire in her eyes was unyielding. Evelyn opened her mouth to retort, but the sharpness of Marie's tone silenced her. Charles reached out, his hand trembling. Marie, I should have protected you. I should have claimed you long before this. But I was weak, selfish, and now all I can do is beg for your forgiveness. He bowed his head lower, his tears falling freely onto the marble floor. The sight was unbearable. Evelyn turned on her heel, storming away, her anger echoing down the hall. Jonathan stood frozen, torn between denial and shock, his mind struggling to reconcile the truth. The staff looked at one another, their loyalties shifting, their perception of the family forever altered. And Marie stood in the center of it all, trembling, overwhelmed, yet stronger than she had ever felt in her life. For the first time, the walls of silence had broken, and her voice had been heard. But forgiveness? That was a wound far deeper than words could heal. As Charles wept at her feet, Marie realized something chilling. Sometimes an apology isn't enough. Sometimes the damage lingers for decades, too sharp, too deep, too permanent to be erased with tears. And now the question loomed, heavy as a storm cloud. Would she ever be able to forgive him? The house, once a fortress of control and order, now felt like a battlefield after an explosion. The echoes of Charles's confession, "She's my daughter," still rang through the marble halls, reverberating in every corner like a haunting bell no one could silence. The staff whispered in the kitchen, their voices hushed but urgent. Jonathan sat alone in the library, pacing, his privileged certainty fractured for the first time in his life. And Evelyn was fury incarnate, pacing their bedroom with clenched fists, her manicured nails digging crescents into her palms. But Marie carried the heaviest weight of all. She had retreated to her small quarters, tucked away at the back of the estate, a modest room that barely reflected the grandeur of the house she maintained. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she pressed her hands together, staring at the cracked mirror opposite her. For years, that reflection had been nothing more than the face of a servant. But now, it stared back at her as something more. Something complicated, unwanted, but undeniable. The hidden daughter of a man who had built his empire on silence and shame. Her chest ached as memories rushed in. She remembered her mother. Strong, kind, but broken by abandonment. She remembered the nights they had gone hungry, the cold winters in their threadbare apartment, the sacrifices her mother had made so she could go to school. And she remembered the day her mother's health failed, the whispered confession before her final breath. Your father, he lives in a world far from ours. He turned his back, but he is yours. I couldn't tell you sooner. I wanted to protect you. Marie had carried that secret like a stone in her pocket. And when she applied for the maid position in his household, she had told herself it was for survival, nothing more. She never intended to reveal herself, never intended to disrupt his life. She had chosen silence because silence was safer. Until now, her door creaked open, and she turned to see Jonathan standing there. His face was pale, his usual smugness gone. He looked like a boy rather than the heir to an empire. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Marie's eyes flickered, but she said nothing. "Tell me," he pressed, stepping inside. "Is it true? Are you really my sister?" The word sister landed heavily between them. Marie looked away, her throat tightening. "I didn't ask for this, Jonathan. I didn't want it. But yes, it's true." Jonathan staggered back, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. He laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "All these years, I thought you were nothing, just a maid. God, I was cruel to you sometimes, wasn't I?" Marie gave a small, sad smile. "You were a child of privilege. You didn't know any better." Jonathan's voice cracked. "That doesn't excuse it. If you're really my sister, then what does that make me? What does that make us?" Marie's eyes met his, calm yet heavy. "It makes us human, flawed, complicated, bound by blood, whether we like it or not." Jonathan looked as though he might break. He ran a hand through his hair, his breath ragged. "Mom's going to lose her mind. She'll never accept this. She'll fight it with everything she has." Marie's voice grew firm. "That's her battle, not mine. I've lived my whole life without her acceptance. I don't need it now." Jonathan's eyes softened, a hint of something new, respect, maybe even guilt. For the first time, he saw Marie not as the help, but as a person, his sister. Meanwhile, Evelyn's rage was boiling over upstairs. She paced their bedroom like a caged animal, her voice sharp as she lashed out at Charles. "Do you realize what you've done? You've humiliated us. You've humiliated me. Do you think the board, the investors, the papers won't hear about this? A maid? A daughter? What do you think this will do to Jonathan's future, to his inheritance?" Charles sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. His voice was quiet, broken. "I don't care about inheritance anymore. I don't care about the board. I care about what's right." Evelyn's laugh was cruel, bitter. "What's right? You're 20 years too late for, right? Charles, you can't just crawl on your knees and expect the world to forgive you. And she pointed a manicured finger at him, her eyes blazing. "I will not stand by while you destroy everything we built." Charles lifted his head slowly, meeting her gaze with a steadiness she hadn't seen in years. "You mean everything you built?" "I built this empire on lies, Evelyn. And maybe it's time it comes crumbling down. Because maybe, just maybe, truth matters more." Her face contorted with fury. "If you choose her, if you choose that maid, you'll lose me. You'll lose everything." Charles's voice was steady, almost eerily calm. "Then so be it." The word struck Evelyn like a slap. For the first time, she realized she was no longer in control. She turned away, her body trembling with rage, her empire slipping like sand between her fingers. Downstairs, Marie stood alone in the hall when Charles appeared, his face pale but determined. He looked older than he had in years, as though the confession had stripped him bare. "I don't deserve it," he began, his voice low. "But I'll ask anyway. Marie, please, please give me a chance to make it right." Marie's heart ached, torn between the child in her who had longed for a father's love and the woman who had survived without it. "You can't erase the years," she said softly. "You can't undo what you did." "I know," Charles whispered, "but maybe I can start by not hiding anymore. By giving you what you've always deserved, recognition, respect, and a place at my side." Marie studied him, her eyes sharp, searching for sincerity. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the ruthless tycoon, but man, flawed, broken, desperate for redemption. And she realized the power was hers now. For years, she had been invisible. But in this moment, she was seen. Whether she chose forgiveness or not, that decision belonged to her and her alone. The days that followed were like a storm that never ended. Lightning flashing behind every glance, thunder rumbling beneath every conversation. What had once been a home of rigid order and wealth now felt like a fragile stage where every step threatened collapse. Evelyn, sharp and calculating, wasted no time plotting her counterattack. To her, Marie was not a daughter, not a human being with pain and story, but a threat, a shadow capable of unraveling decades of carefully curated reputation. In her private sitting room, she made calls on a golden phone, her voice hushed but venomous. Lawyers, public relations strategists, even private investigators. She summoned them all like pieces on a chessboard. She must go. Evelyn hissed her closest confidant over the line. I don't care how. She cannot stay here. She cannot exist in our narrative. Do you understand? Destroy her if you must. Her eyes burned with a cold fire. To Evelyn, this was not merely about family. It was about control, power, survival. Marie was a crack in the glass, and Evelyn would rather shatter the whole pane than allow the world to see the fracture. Meanwhile, Charles tried desperately to hold on to the fragile thread that connected him to Marie. He sought her out at every opportunity, not to command, but to ask, to listen. He sat with her in the kitchen one evening, the same kitchen where for years he had never so much as poured his own glass of water. I don't know where to start, he admitted, his voice low, his hands trembling as he held his untouched cup of coffee. How do I make up for the years I abandoned you? How do I begin to repair something I broke before it even had a chance to grow? Marie listened quietly, her fingers curled around her own mug. For so long, she had rehearsed this moment in her mind. What she would say, how she would unleash the fury stored inside her chest. But when she looked at him now, she didn't see the monster she had built in her imagination. She saw a man stripped of his armor, fragile and raw. You can't make up for the years, she said finally, her voice calm but steady. You can't buy back time. You can't erase what you did to my mother, or to me, but you can choose who you'll be today. That's the only thing you have left. Charles's throat tightened. He nodded slowly, as if etching her words into his bones. But upstairs, Evelyn was already weaving her trap. She cornered Jonathan in the library, her voice urgent, manipulative. You can't let this stand, she told him, her manicured hands gripping his shoulders. Do you understand what this will do to you? To your inheritance? That girl will take everything. She'll ruin your future. Jonathan's eyes were conflicted. The spoiled arrogance that once defined him had dimmed since the revelation, replaced with confusion and a strange, unwelcome guilt. But she's my sister, Mother. I can't just pretend she doesn't exist. Evelyn's grip tightened. She's not your sister. She's an intruder, a parasite who worked her way into this house to steal what's yours. Don't be fooled by her act. Do you think she really came here by accident? She planned this, Jonathan. All of it. Her words slithered into his ear, planting seeds of doubt. Jonathan pulled away, shaking his head. I don't know. She doesn't seem. She is. Evelyn snapped. And if you don't stand against her, you'll lose everything. Don't forget Jonathan. This empire will one day be yours, unless you let her take it. Jonathan's jaw tightened, torn between the truth his heart whispered and the poison his mother poured. Downstairs, Marie began to notice things changing. Her work assignments shifted. Tasks she had always handled were suddenly stripped from her. Rumors circulated among the staff. Ugly whispers that painted her as manipulative, as conniving, as a gold digger who had always plotted to entangle herself in the family's fortune. Evelyn's fingerprints were all over it, invisible yet undeniable. Marie bore the whispers in silence, but at night she cried quietly into her pillow, the years of resilience wearing thin. She had wanted nothing but honesty. She had never wanted to be seen as a thief. Yet here she was, vilified in the very home where she had spent a decade scrubbing floors. Charles noticed a change. He saw the way the staff looked at her differently, the way Evelyn sharpened her tongue whenever Marie entered the room, and something inside him shifted. For years, he had been a man who ran from battles, who chose wealth and image over truth. But now, he felt a fire he hadn't known in decades, the fire of a father who would not allow his child be destroyed again. One evening, as the family gathered in the dining room, Evelyn struck. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room, she announced coolly, her eyes darting to Marie with razor-sharp precision. "This girl, this so-called daughter of yours, do you really expect us to believe her story? Do you expect the world to—" Marie's fork froze midway to her mouth. The staff who hovered nearby lowered their eyes, uncomfortable but listening. Charles's jaw tightened. "Evelyn." But Evelyn cut him off. "She's a liar, Charles. A manipulator. She played her role well, didn't she? 10 years in this house, all while waiting for the right moment to spring her little performance. How convenient that her mother is no longer alive to confirm or deny her tale." Gasps murmured across the room. Marie's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to lower her gaze. Charles slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Enough!" His voice roared, filled with a power that silenced everyone. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes blazing. "You can twist this however you like, but the truth will not change. She is my daughter, my blood, and I will not allow you or anyone to erase her from this family again." Evelyn's face twisted with fury, but Charles was relentless. He rose to his feet, his voice shaking but strong. "For too long, I've lived in fear of the truth. I let shame dictate my choices. I let pride turn me into a coward. But no more. If protecting Marie cost me my fortune, my marriage, even my reputation, so be it. I would rather lose everything than lose her again." His words hung in the air, thunderous, defiant. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her face pale with rage. She realized in that moment that she was losing not just control of her husband, but control of the narrative she had built like a fortress around them. Marie sat frozen, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. For the first time in her life, her father had spoken for her, defended her. A part of her heart, the broken, abandoned child inside her, wanted to collapse into his arms. Another part, hardened by years of pain, whispered caution. The battle lines were drawn. Evelyn would not stop. Jonathan stood on the edge, wavering, unsure which side he would choose. And Charles, finally awake to the weight of his failures, had made his stand. But Marie knew the storm was far from over. Evelyn was not the kind of woman to surrender. And forgiveness, true forgiveness, was still a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. The grand ballroom that once echoed with arrogance and laughter now carried a heavy silence. The billionaire, William Harrington, knelt on the marble floor, his perfectly tailored suit crumpling, his hands trembling as they reached toward Maria. The maid he had dismissed, insulted, and crushed beneath the weight of his pride. It was a sight so unimaginable that every witness in that room would carry it for the rest of their lives. The wealthiest man in the city, the untouchable titan of steel and glass towers, bowing before the woman he had once called just a maid. Tears streaked down his face, washing away the massive power he had so carefully constructed. His voice cracked as he whispered words no one ever thought he was capable of speaking. "Maria, I am sorry. Please forgive me." The audience gasped. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. In that moment, status, titles, and wealth meant nothing. The billions in his bank account could not erase the cruelty he had inflicted. His knees pressed against the cold stone like a penance. His pride shattered in front of the very people whose approval he once lived for. Maria stood before him, her posture upright, her eyes steady, but her heart racing with memories, nights of exhaustion, years of being invisible, the humiliation of being treated as less than human. Yet, she had also seen the pain in his confession. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the master of skyscrapers, but a broken man desperate for redemption. And here lay the power shift. For decades, William had owned everything money could buy, but the one thing he now begged for could never be purchased: forgiveness. The crowd waited with bated breath. Would Maria lift him up? Would she forgive? Or would she walk away, leaving him crushed beneath the weight of his guilt? Maria's silence stretched like a taut string, holding the room in suspense. She thought of the countless times she had scrubbed floors until her fingers bled, the birthdays she had missed for her children, while working double shifts in his mansion, the insults that had cut deeper than any blade. Yet she also remembered her grandmother's words. "Child, don't let hate chain you. Mercy is not for them. It is for your own soul." Slowly, She spoke, her voice strong, resonant, and filled with the authority of someone who had endured and survived. I will forgive you, but not for your sake. I forgive you so I can be free. Gasps swept across the ballroom again, but this time they carried awe, not shock. Maria turned away, her dignity intact, leaving William kneeling in the wreckage of his empire, knowing that true power did not lie in wealth or influence, but in grace, resilience, and a courage to rise above cruelty. The guests, once complicit in William's arrogance, now turned their eyes toward Maria with reverence. In that moment, she was no longer just a maid. She was a symbol of strength, a reminder of the humanity that exists beneath titles and riches. Word of the event spread like wildfire. The press captured the image. The billionaire kneeling, the maid standing tall. The photograph made front-page headlines across the globe, sparking debates in boardrooms, coffee shops, and living rooms. Memes and think pieces flooded social media. Some mocked William, some celebrated Maria, but all agreed it was a reckoning unlike any the world had seen. And while William's empire crumbled under scandal, Maria's life transformed. She was offered speaking engagements, her story told in magazines, universities, and community centers. She did not seek fame, but her experience became a beacon for countless workers who had been overlooked, mistreated, and silenced. She built a foundation for domestic workers, giving them legal support, education, and a platform for their voices. Years later, when asked how she found the strength to stand tall, while a billionaire knelt before her, Maria simply smiled and said, "Because I finally realized I was never just a maid. I was always more." And no amount of money could change that truth. The audience in the interview applauded, some with tears in their eyes, others with admiration burning in their hearts. For in her story, they saw the reminder that dignity cannot be bought, respect cannot be demanded, and forgiveness is the greatest act of rebellion against those who try to diminish us. The story closed not with the billionaire's downfall, but with Maria's rise, a testament that no matter how small society tries to make you, your worth is immeasurable. And as for William Harrington, he lived the rest of his life not as the man who owned the tallest towers, but as the man who knelt before a maid. His legacy was forever rewritten, not in the steel of his skyscrapers, but in the humility of his knees pressed to the cold floor.